Thanks, Robot Lady. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to December 19th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. Today, we're going to have a fairly free-formed scientific governance and risk meeting. It's the end of the year. It's been a long road, very long road. We've had a lot of interesting things happen, and my suspicion is that there's a lot of conversations that we can just be having these days outside of reacting to recent events, dealing with emergencies, trying to figure out which pole is which and what we're doing now. We have a little bit of breathing room this week. And so what I would like to do is we'll talk about what's happening in the forums, with Governance at a Glance, with LongForWisdom, Cyrus, Younesssi, if he shows up. We'll be talking about the state of migration. And possibly, I don't know whether we've firmed this up, but discussing what a DSR spread would look like as opposed to a combination or random levers that are designed to combine into a DSR spread, which is a topic that I am interested in and still need some deeper insight into.
Yeah,
we will hear.
What's that? And Sam is actually on the call, so Sam has been spearheading that whole conversation in the forums.
Nice. That's actually Sam. Oh, there he is. I don't know if we've ever
Hello.
seen him before. Yeah, how's it going, man?
Yeah, it's my first time on the call talking.
Right on. That's actually a really serendipitous event, because what I wanted to talk about today, what I wanted to use that free time was to deal with some of the issues that you've been bringing up, and some of the other people in the forums too, is that for the longest time, we've been talking about open source governance, or open governance and community governance. And I've been encouraging the community to join the forums, and that's where we do governance, and we discuss these issues, and we have debates, and we hash things out. And then eventually these debates crystallize into polls and votes in the portal. And lo and behold, you people started doing it. And that was a bit of a surprise to me, because we need to figure out what an end-to-end pipeline looks like. And right now, there's a tremendous amount of very exciting activity happening in the forum, but we're still cutting our teeth on what to do with that activity once it happens. And that's one of the things that maybe we can start doing some brainstorming on today, or maybe LongForWisdom can offer some deeper insight. But what I would like to begin to think about is, how do we take this activity, how do we foster it, how do we ensure that people that are raising these signals are being heard and feel like they're being heard? Well, feelings are nice, but also let's just ensure that they are being heard, and that there's some activity that's that arises out of these signals, and some clear path to, like, okay, this thing has happened, now this thing happens, and then 5 or 10 things happen after that, and then we have a vote. And I think that we still don't have that clarity, and it's something that we need to define, because these are basic but very, very tricky questions, and those tricky questions are it's almost hard for me to ask these questions because it sounds so absurd, but they're actually significant. So what is consensus, and how do you measure that, and when do you decide that that's been achieved? That's a tough question, because well, it's obviously a tough question. And the solution that I've seen in other organizations, or other crypto or non-crypto, is the concept of rough consensus. And I have not been shy about my terror every time I hear that term, because frequently rough consensus can be shorthand for the right person is just sick of talking about stuff, and now other things are going to happen, or people are sick of talking about stuff, and then so maybe we'll just do whatever the last person said. So it's a very tricky thing to do. So rough consensus frequently can just become a judgment call, or an executive decision based on the amount of swing that a person has. I want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So let's do a recap of what the actual vision is. And LongForWisdom, you can jump in too, because you are one of the primary architects of coming up with process for the forums, but also at least formalizing it into various threads. And so my understanding of this process looks like this. We have these debates, we have calls, we have chats, we have forum threads, we have subreddits, we have a bunch of different ways that signals and ideas and conversations happen, because all of those venues are temporal and subject to disappearing or filtering up out of the window and never to be seen again. We needed a way to capture these plans and policies and procedures, and that has a longer tail. It gives us an opportunity to debate these things. And so the forum is the place to do that, where we can all collect the stuff. We can have a conversation that lasts days, or we can have one that lasts 6 months. It doesn't really matter, as long as those ideas aren't lost and that somebody can come in and build on them. That is working effectively up until this point. The next step after that conversation happens in the forums is that those ideas get debated, tossed around, augmented, and then refined, and then we take the distillation of these ideas and then we create a proposal, or I guess we'll call it a proposal. And that's a forum thread that clearly defines the problem space and the potential solution and the requirements behind this thing, and includes a poll, a forum poll, that asks the community to signal what they think should happen here. And then after an appropriate amount of time, after the signal's been gathered, a decision gets made. Potentially there's iteration. So if everybody's, if it's contentious, if nobody agrees, if it needs to be some revision, then you can iterate a bit. But once you hit the final version, that poll is basically shut down, and then the consensus has been reached at that point. Debate has ended. That's the very tricky line that I'm not sure that we've determined where that is yet. And then the interim governance facilitator gets notified that the community has done a thing, and that thing needs to show up in the poll. And then it's my job to copy and paste and click a bunch of buttons and do a bunch of forum activity, and then basically paralegal that stuff right into a portal for the community to vote on. That is the last piece of this process, which is far more complicated than what I described. But that's the last piece of the process where I'm thinking that there's less clarity than we need. So maybe that's where I'm gonna. That's the context. So maybe I'm gonna open this up to some suggestions or ideas, or maybe LongForWisdom, you want to jump in.
Actually, can I also maybe add a little bit more to the context? So like ultimately, MKR token holders are the ones who make the executive decisions and the decisions in the governance polls. But what we're doing in the forum is largely like determining how best to structure the actual questions being asked, what the options should be, what direction makes the most sense to go in. So ultimately, like this question of consensus on the forums will always seem to be rough, but is ultimately crystallized by MKR token holders when the votes.
Yeah, that's a good observation. So let me talk about that for a second. So the idea here is we started off with the governance portal, and in the governance portal, polls would show up, and those polls, for the vast majority of our history, have been should the stability fee go up or should stability fee go down for Psi? That was not a complex or very chaotic environment. So it was fairly simple. And so we built some processes and procedures around that. And that was controlled by maker holders, because that's the system that we designed, and it seems to work so far. Once the forum showed up, though, we had to start asking some interesting questions, because we have there's a lot of paradigms at work when you talk about voting, and one of those paradigms are that people hear the word vote and they assume representative democracy, and that's not what we have here. We have shareholder voting, or an analog to shareholder voting, where whoever has the most to lose presumably is most engaged in the ecosystem and is spending the time that's required to understand the issues completely. But we also have a very large demographic of people that don't have a ton of skin in the game, but are also deeply engaged and also invested in the success of the ecosystem. So how do we communicate with them, and how do they communicate with us, and how do we signal the signalers? And that's essentially what's going on in the forum. And so the question became in the past, okay, well, how do we get something? Polling is a signaling pool. And the question became, how do we get a signal that determines whether we need a signaling pool? And then we started wondering whether this is infinitely recursive. We have to have signals to get signals to get signals. But the answer is actually no. What we do is, in the forums, the world can come in here. And obviously it's not civil resistance, and sock puppetry is an ever-present risk, and all kinds of weird things happen. But it's far closer to having a representative democracy in the forums than what we have in the portal. And that's an interesting dichotomy that actually works, because we've seen that it's the community that does the heavy lifting. It's that comes up with the ideas, it does the process, that sets the context, that collects the data, that frames the debate, and then sort of hands that off to the maker holders and says, okay, here you go. What do you think? And then it's been, and then they vote yes or no. And it's been fairly inspiring so far to see that the maker holders have been following along this process and basically highly aligned with the will of the people, the 50 odd people that we're talking about and that show up in the forums. But it's still early days, and so that's the process we have. And so that's the question. Thanks for that insight, David. That how do we refine this people, we the people type environment that we have in the forums, and ensure that that process is efficient and clear enough to get to stop things from languishing or disappearing or whatever else happens, and get that stuff into the forums or into the portal in a appropriate amount of time.
So that actually brings up an interesting thing that happened this week, and Long4Wisdom can probably talk about it, but the signaling guidelines thread, when the forum was launched, was one of the first threads that came out that described any sort of process in the forum. And it was a thread basically about, if you're a participant in our governance community, then this is how you go about gathering a signal. And actually, I think a couple days ago, Long4Wisdom reset the poll. There's a poll at the bottom of that thread that just says signed and agreed to all these kind of loose guidelines. And an interesting few changes were made. So Long4Wisdom, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the updated signaling guidelines?
Yeah, that'd be a good place to start, actually. And please, before that goes or kicks off, I usually have a preamble. I'm not sure if people can hear it anymore, but let's try it again. We are desperately interested in anybody in this room who has an opinion. Please jump in. Just open up the mic, start talking, interrupt us, type it in the chat. Treat this venue as being just any meeting you have in your office at any time, right? There's no pride of place. It's not a presentation. It's not a live stream. It's people in a business meeting having a chat about their business. So anybody here has an opinion, please let us know. Jump right in.
Cool. So I will. Yeah, I'll briefly summarize the changes I made, I guess, to the signaling guidelines. They weren't actually like major changes. It was just like clearing up some stuff that we talked about before, and that's sort of been like left aside at the wayside, based on what we've been doing recently. So I detailed in the thread what I changed. There was a point that said polls should stay open until the poll moves on chain, which I don't think is necessarily always a good idea. Point 6, proposal changes, polls stayed the same. I took that out just because, well, you can't change polls in the forum. Sometimes you want to like add new polls that sort of get into the specifics of the question, as we've sort of seen this week with a couple of people's signals. And then I added a point to sort of highlight that the person who's posting the signal request kind of should be responsible for running the signal request to its completion.
I like that one.
You like that one?
That's my favorite point that you added, because I think that gives people kind of like not an obligation, but like a more push towards responsibility to carry out the original thread, because the original poster is making all of the introductory arguments and like putting up the first sort of opinion on any given matter. So for that person to make sure that that conversation is kind of seen through to completion and that it doesn't sink, it scales pretty well, and it also puts the most passionate person in charge, which I think is kind of intuitive.
I think it's good in some ways and bad in other ways, because you have this sort of, we haven't seen this yet obviously, but you have this sort of issue where you can have people who really care about a thing that no one else is really that interested in, just sort of pushing and taking up space for things that people aren't really super worried about. Right. So there's always like an element of like, make sure that people are actually interested in what you're talking about. but yeah, in general, I think it's the most sensible way to lay it out.
it's one of the things that I've been wrestling around with as well is people have great ideas and they put those great ideas into the forum, and it's what expectation should we be creating for the community? Because it's like I come into the forum, I go, okay, here's my great idea, see you around, and then what happens after that, right? Is there an expectation that people need to campaign for their changes, that they need to do work in order to make them happen, or is there an expectation that there's some entity or some group that comes along and goes, oh, okay, there's a great idea, let's start working on that one? So that's the thing that I'm kind of wrestling with sometimes.
Yeah.
The way I see it is that if somebody's surfacing an idea, like obviously it's like super highly contextual, so I don't know, it really depends on the merit of the idea.
All right, well, let's, I pointed out that anybody can ask questions at any time, but that hasn't happened yet, so I'm just going to start calling on names. So let's see how well that works. Sam, you turned your camera on, you fool. All right, so maybe you can give us some insight into how what your thoughts are about how the process works in the forums, whether people are engaged enough, or whether you'd like things to change and what those changes would be. I don't know. Do you have any observations?
Sure. So I've kind of started leaning into this a bit more with the DSR poll. I guess the first post I made that kind of got a little bit of conversation was, what was it about? It was about the DSR spread should be close to 0 as sort of a business direction decision. I was arguing that we should keep the global stability fee and the DSR at roughly the same level, just to encourage growth of the system. That was cool. It was more of a discussion one. You know, some people talk like, yeah, it seemed good. And then I moved over to another poll that I ran, or actually, did I do 2? Okay. The DSR spread one, I put that out, and just sort of another thought. And then somebody's like, oh, you should put a poll on it. And I didn't look at the signaling thread before, probably should have. But then I kind of retroactively tried to fit it towards a signaling request. And after receiving some feedback, I realized, maybe I didn't frame it exactly right. I don't think I explained it very well. So I think it was about a week later, I made another thread, just trying to be more objective, trying to list all the cons that people were listing in the previous thread and the pros. Obviously I'm biased on it, but tried to remain as neutral as I could. And there's definitely a lot more traction on that second one. But again, I get to that second one, and like people are posting valid objections that I hadn't really considered. And so, I'm kind of going back and forth on it a little bit myself now. And the poll is kind of, it's not even, but it's not like clear, strong yes. So I don't know, it's been a learning process, and I'm doing my best to try and follow the guidelines, and just a learning process. I feel like even right now I'm like, I should do a third attempt at this, but I don't want to just keep going signal thread over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge that we've all run into with the signal threads. Yeah. Is how do we do this? Because obviously there's, okay, here's the overhead, here's the amount of work it requires to get a signal into the system. It's not insignificant. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we've seen what it looks like when we've had initiatives and signals come from the forums that were not, the edge cases weren't considered. And we've already run into things like the debt ceiling is kind of an example where it was a long debate, a really good one, great idea, let's just maintain a buffer. And then literally immediately out of the gate, the debt ceiling behaved in ways, or the amount of circulating DAI behaved in ways that nobody had anticipated, and that debt ceiling vote was incapable, as written, with dealing with maintaining a buffer. And also as written, expired almost immediately because MCD got released. And so there's a lot of really weird edge cases that need to be considered. There's a lot of debates that need to happen. Those debates and those polls take time, and so we need to have these iterations and then these reviews. And then it's a long road. Like it could take months, literally months, to get a new poll into the system. And we need to, that loops back to my original thoughts around how do we pick up this process? How do we accelerate it or maintain it? And
so if you have a second, what's interesting about so Sam's experience made me think, right? You know, anytime we put up a signal thread, it's really trying to get to the best possible decision for our aim as a governing body of the Maker protocol, right? And so, like, whenever you put up a thread, Sam even said, you know, sometimes there's a lot of things that people hadn't considered. So we need to go through this sort of iterating process and like continue to kind of refine the signal thread or the issue thread multiple times before we get to like a very clear TLDR pros and cons kind of breakdown. And I was talking to LongForWisdom about an additional guideline that would be pretty cool to have, and it seems that Sam has already been doing it, but listing sort of a TLDR in the top level new thread once it's refined or something like that. But just yeah, just an interesting observation that it seems to be that when we do have these threads, they really are kind of exploring the idea more than just expecting a straightaway answer for what the right decision is to come up right away.
yeah, I've been wrestling with that too. Is you present here's a problem statement, here's some options, and then having a poll immediately has always felt weird to me because that presupposes that you understand the scope of the issue in isolation and that you presented this to the community, and frequently that's not always the case. And so people will come into this forum thread, they'll read the initial post, they'll vote, and then weeks or a week or days, who knows, whatever, there's a debate that happens. And then the expectation there is that if this position gets more clearly defined and somebody changes their standing on this issue, we are expecting them to come back to this thread on a regular basis and then update their votes to reflect the ever shaping or developing shape of that debate. And I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case. So it's when the poll happens and what the poll items are, and how long that poll exists are things that are still hazy in my mind.
Can I speak to this a little bit, like with the signaling initial? Yeah. So part of the process I have started doing, and I described in one of the threads, was that the initial poll should be basically be as general as possible. Like, so a super general expression of like, should we change from what we have now to something else? With the idea that giving that lets you immediately get a rough idea of if it's enough people want change for it to be worth pursuing, so you can early out and avoid the sort of running this process.
But I would disagree with that phrasing a bit. Sorry, like, should we make this change or should we not? Like, that should be decided after the fact.
Well, so this is the thing. At this point, you're not saying you want to move to a specific change. You're just saying I want a change of some sort. Like, it's
yeah, but even more generally, you could phrase it maybe as, are you open to making a change on this? Oh, like being open, not do you want this or do you not want this?
Like a straw poll, it just says, does the community think this is interesting? Should we pursue this line of debate?
Yeah,
that's really cool.
Anyway, so the idea is if that stage is the initial stage, which lasts for, say, like I think in the thing it was a week or 2 weeks. But the point is, if you sort of have a stage which is sort of that sort of general question, then you have a chance for people to bring up objections and to sort of suggest like solutions and things. And that kind of works well when people are sort of engaged from the beginning. But if people don't engage or don't think about it before it gets to this more specific stage, it becomes a bit of a problem because you sort of define a bunch of specifics, and only at that point do people come and say, well, wait a minute, this specific doesn't work because of this, or this would be a better idea because of this. And
there's additional complexity. Some of these things are time sensitive, right? Like, should we raise the debt ceiling? Presumably can't wait for 2.5 months for the debate to peter out.
So that's the other problem. Like I think the initial SCD debt ceiling process I did took like 5 weeks to finish, which was like, like I don't know how you can make it both like efficient and like sort of very efficient and also representative of like consensus, because it just doesn't work. It's a trade-off, right?
Well, yeah, that's the other trade-off too, right? Like the shorter the time window, presumably the lower the engagement, right?
Excuse me, I have a quick question about this. A couple of weeks ago, either the last week or the week before, we talked about like approved like proposals being taken into effect when needed instantly, and then the community voting on whether they want to keep these changes after an emergency situation had gone past.
I think you're
Yeah.
referencing the debt ceiling, like the conditional vote, right? Am I
Well,
Yes,
no,
I am.
there was also, I think that was around do we suspend monetary policy in order to do fixes, and the solution was, okay, well, yeah, let's just do something fast this time, and we'll talk about it afterwards for next week. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, I am. And
Yeah.
you can use the same tactic for multiple decisions in governance. As people have been mentioning here, people with ownership of the project and of the ideas that they want to implement are the ones that are going to push and lobby for their ideas and proposals to be done. There should be some selected people that have been dedicating themselves in this community and in the governance of Maker and of DAI so much that they should be given the opportunity to change things if needed during emergencies.
Yeah, that's a great
Perhaps
conversation. I would
perhaps
love
we
to
can
have.
use the same idea to implement other policy proposals, like other proposals, in not necessarily like not fundamentally important aspects of governance. Now, I missed a few minutes of the start, and I don't know what proposals specifically you're talking about as examples. I would love to hear a bit more about that.
I don't know if we actually came up with specific examples yet. They all seem to fall under the same kind of pressures. Like we're talking about, when does consensus happen? When is debate over? How does the signal get reached? How do we optimize that process so people come up with an idea in a forum and it gets into the portal? Like how quickly can we, how efficient can we make that situation? And I think that one of the things that you just touched on is something that we're going to see develop more and more. But it's an interesting road to walk down, because we're all here presumably because we want to be self-sovereign. We want to have complete agency over our decision-making processes, and we don't want to be told what to do. But the sad fact of the matter is it's a whole pile of work, being self-sovereign. I do not have time to be self-sovereign in the areas of risk, because I don't understand half the stuff that those people are up to. So the community, I think, is in the same boat, and so we have identified that, okay, here's a risk team. They have domain expertise. Let's empower them to do interim risk types things, and then once they do it, we'll just say yes or no. That seems like a really great idea to me and everybody else apparently. So that's what we do. The question becomes, do we explore additional groups of empowered actors to do things? Like we have the Oracle teams, we have the risk team, there's interim governance facilitator. What if there was a group of people from the community that were empowered to sort of shepherd or manage these new initiatives that show up in the forums, like signal watchers or something? Like, oh, look at this is interesting. Let's talk to Sam. Let's figure out what the idea is. Let's help the debate. Let's make sure that people are engaged. Let's do. I'm sort of like a project manager for new proposals, or an account manager or something, or a group of account managers, somebody that could shepherd this stuff through the ecosystem, empowered by the community, for the community, would be an interesting
The question
thing.
is really like how formal you want it to be, because like at the moment, it goes so far as, we spec'd out the risk team, the Oracle team, I think some other team, but no, just the risk team and the Oracle team, and then the interim governance facilitator, right? And like Xenophon, that's a little bit about what you were talking to, having that kind of like actor that does put their foot down, or like execute, or like take in all the stuff that's happening and like take some, ownership and move things forward. But that's why I liked LongForWisdom's new addition to the signal request guidelines, is that the owner of a certain topic should try to create like a working group out of their discussion that's happening. But yeah, sorry, just thinking out loud.
Now, I understand that's quite difficult, especially depending on the cases of proposals, right? In standard political science, there are proposals that take a supermajority to pass. perhaps we should look into traditional political science when it comes to decision making as a community to find important factors in the system that we shouldn't change unless we have a supermajority, versus others that we can test either in a test net or I don't know, a fork. I doubt that we want to do forks, but and we can't particularly do forks here, I understand. But it's important to define some systems that shouldn't change. You define some systems that should follow in 50% majorities, and then you should look at proposals and ways that we can test the proposals and see how they work in reality, like we do with marketing with A/B testing. Do the same with some of the proposals added here and proposed.
Yeah, I think that defining which issues need which level of consensuses might be like a logical, like near-term step that we could take as a community. But yeah, that's really interesting comments.
Yeah, and it raises another interesting area of exploration too, because the way that governance in MakerDAO has been developed is it's a constantly evolving process. There's some broad strokes about continuous approval voting and signaling through polls, and then we've been iterating on that process over time, and the expectation that the model that we need is going to shift rapidly, and we need to be responsive, but we also need to have a general idea of where it is that we're going. And so the question becomes, though, that there's no shortage of real world information about how to govern yourself, and so picking and choosing what would be useful from established political science and picking those pieces and then bringing them into the crypto world is a fascinating area of research. It's something that we should possibly consider, because the thing that actually, I don't want to make predictions, so let's just look back at what happened. So we started off with one maker, one vote, and we moved into debates, forum threads, consensus-seeking models, pre-polling, empowered actors, ratifying particular mandates for roles to take on additional responsibilities. And so we're inching sort of closer and closer to real world analogs without jumping in completely, because presumably we don't want to recreate insert your local government here. We don't want to do whatever it is everybody else is doing. So formalizing that process, I think, might be interesting. But the problem here is that we need people to do that, and there needs to be some concerted effort. And I think that this ties back to identifying engaged actors from the community and trying to figure out how to help them to do work. So I just rephrased all of the questions without providing any clear solutions. So there you go. I'm not going to either, because it's not my job to do that. This is the community's up to, right? So it's the community owned, it's open governance. So this group and the group in the forums should be leading MakerDAO, or Maker Foundation, not the other way around. So let's continue to ask these questions. I don't know if there's questions in the sidebar or whether I just board people into submission.
There was a couple. I think Mitsote asked if instant access modules were potentially a real thing. They are a very real thing, and they will happen.
Yeah, the instant access modules are like the next step in some of the things that we've been talking about, allowing empowered actors or domain experts sandbox in which to do things that is non-destructive is definitely an experiment we're going to be conducting. I'm not sure if is there anybody on the call from the foundation that feels comfortable giving us like a 5-minute recap of what innocent access module looks like? It still might be a bit early for them. Possibly not. I just surprised people. They're spitting their Cheerios into the floor trying to grab a mic. So those are things that we'll be exploring. There's going to be a significant amount of debate, and there has to be documentation, and people need to understand how these things work and who's going to be in control of them and where they live and all the rest of it. So we're not there right now, though.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that LongForWisdom is asking if we can switch gears and start talking about the emergency shutdown stuff.
Yes, that's an interesting one. And I'm feeling like it's time for me to throw people under the bus. If only Cyrus and Younesssi would show up to this meeting and start answering some questions, that'd be nice. Oh, there he
Cyrus
is.
is here.
I know. It amuses me to pretend that he's late for these things.
Oh,
All right. But yeah, the emergency shutdown is a fantastically important conversation that we need to have for all kinds of reasons. And that this is a huge shifting of gears because we're just talking about how to do governance correctly. And this is about risk. And I don't want to say anything particularly stupid. So, Cyrus,
Well,
meet
maybe
bus.
we can
Hang
first
on,
get
yeah,
like
maybe.
maybe we could first get like a TLDR of the issue and the thread that's been going on. So, LongForWisdom, do you want to maybe talk about it for a sec?
Yeah, that sounds good. So yeah, this is in relation to IMEO's threads that he posted a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I think. Basically just ask questions about the actual process, in emergency shutdown, and also specifically recovering from emergency shutdown afterwards. Like, so the presumption is the foundation has like a plan as to what's going to happen in that case, like if that should happen, in terms of freezing, attacking, like governance attacking Maker, or redeploying the system, etc., etc. But none of that's really very transparent to the community, and I think there's some desire to get some more like visibility on what that process would look like, so that if it does happen, then we're like not so panicked and like wondering what the hell's going to happen.
Yep, that sounds like a great idea. And we have system architects, Mariano, Vishesh, Andy. I'm going to call you guys out specifically. That might have deeper insight. So here's some context, or brief context. Emergency shutdown is many things to many people. It's the ultimate policy tool. So it's the ultimate lever in which to enforce the will of maker token holders and to, well, in many ways, maintain the peg, depending on how philosophical you want to get about this thing. There is mechanical processes, so what happens in the code. There's social processes, how do people behave during an emergency shutdown. There's game theoretical ideas about what happens after. How do we view a post shutdown world? Those are a lot of questions, and most of them are outside of my area of expertise, and so we'd need some additional insights here.
Yeah, Simuni said something really interesting in the chat. If you want, get on the mic. I know.
Yeah, there's foundation members here, and I'd like to remind people that this is your call as well. So if you're from the foundation and you have insight, please add to the conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that I think the foundation has a really good technical idea of how we would redeploy the system, and we could probably redeploy it in any number of states that governance would want. But there's a really big question about whether or not an emergency shutdown was triggered either through the ESM, and if that action was malicious, or by governance, and if that action was malicious, and if it was to stop an attack. So then the question is, there's obviously going to be some sort of split in maker holders at that point, and how do we determine who is justified? Who's the right actor? So that's, I think, the thing that people should discuss. I don't have any great ideas. I concede it with one idea, which is, let's say this was a malicious governance action and an emergency shutdown was triggered through the module to try and stop it. Clearly, there's a proposal that has a bunch of maker on it, and clearly there's a bunch of maker that was burned in the ESM. Maybe you disregard both of those pools of maker, and whatever's left over is the people that could reconstitute the system. But by just stating that as a proposal, then an attacking side could just hold an additional amount of maker on the sidelines to, yeah, so I don't know, have at it.
It's part of the problem then that defining a process like is actively harmful, because you are then setting up like expectations for like an attacker to like abuse.
Yeah, that's a major consideration for sure. Yeah.
I heard the idea for like to prevent governance attacks that anybody voting with their MKR basically has to have it like locked for 24 hours. They can't like withdraw it from voting contract. Like it would be an upgrade to the current voting contract where if somebody was to do a malicious attack, then they couldn't just, do the flash attack and then instantly like sell all the MKR. They would have to have it locked in the system. So they would get caught, they would get slashed, and outside users that might have previously bought the malicious governance attacking MKR would not be hurt if the system were to be like shut down, or if the MKR distribution were to be reconstituted or something like that. But I can't remember exactly where I read or heard that suggestion. I just popped into mind.
It's come up a couple of times. I think it's like Miko laid it out in the thread as an option, and like I've considered it before. Like if you lock for like the duration of the governance delay, the security delay, then you should be able to stop attackers from like laundering the maker into other assets, which would make the freeze and redeploy easier potentially.
Yeah. Is there any specific point in that thread that we're seeking comment on?
I think a couple of people in the thread were basically just like more interaction in the thread from the foundation, just because a lot of these things aren't really very clear. So I mean, yeah, I guess like sort of echoing what sort of Simon said, like that we have some things we have like good technical roadmaps of like what needs to happen to redeploy, but we don't, like the governance bit is perhaps more up in the air or needs to be discussed and considered or whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of these will come in due time. A lot of the operational procedures are probably underspecified at this point, but from what I know, there's still like a bunch of work going into emergency shutdown in terms of not just the redeployment, but just a lot of operational aspects that can make it easier for the users, how users will actually claim collateral and do a whole bunch of stuff. So I would, I guess, just say be patient, because I think there's still more kind of more front end and I guess documentation work that's still on its way.
All right. Yeah. So I don't know if that's the most satisfying response.
Yeah, it's
Cyrus, but it's something that we definitely do as a foundation and as a community. We need to continue to explore this thing because it's no longer a theoretical event. Like historically, the emergency shutdown has been the specter of trying to survive something that was really bad, or potentially shutting down the system in response to a black swan event. And we are, at least from what I'm seeing in the community, there's this dawning realization that the community, this is a tool that the community is going to need to use at some point when it determines that if or when it's no longer willing to support the SCD ecosystem. So this becomes more pressing as we have additional debates that are discussing when emergency shutdown should happen, as opposed to what is it and how does it work. So yeah, we can't lose momentum on clarifying what this tool actually is and what it looks like. Because I have to admit that I'm hazy on some of the specifics myself. It'd be great to get additional clarity. But in the absence of a system architect pointing out that there's a doc somewhere in GitHub that explains all of this stuff, that's going to be an ongoing conversation, I think. What I want to do now, though, I'm going to exercise the enormous amount of power that I have to execute segues. All right, so there's that was a long debate, so it's far longer than I expected. I assumed I was just going to fill some time and ask some questions I thought were interesting, but happily people jumped in, so that's super cool. We have 10 minutes before the top of the hour, though, and we still have some regular segments to get into, like State of the Peg and Governance at a Glance, and Cyrus is going to give us an update on migration. So
So
I
Rick,
don't know which ones we should
before
do
you guys
first.
jump into those segments, let me just quickly. This is more just a placeholder, really. We are working on emergency shutdown and specifically with regards to redeeming DAI and excess collateral. So I'm in the process working with the dev teams on mocking up what the UI looks like, how users will access that. Essentially, it's going to be a component on the migration app that users will be able to interact with. So like I said, nothing to show here, but in the new year, pretty soon, we should have something to walk you through and illustrate the cursed UI. Well, it's better than the CLI. Yeah, I definitely want to show that to you guys soon. So like I said, placeholder, I'll take another look at Mika's blog, and if there's stuff we can add to that, then definitely will. So yeah, thanks.
All right, cool. Thanks for that update, Derek. LongForWisdom, did you touch on the forum threads you wanted to touch on, or were there other things that we should dig into?
I've done most of them, yeah. I would just sort of say there are currently 4 signal requests active. So this is the DSR spread that Sam set up. There are 2 signal requests regarding SCD shutdown, which Aaron Barch has set up. And then I've set up one up, which is to do with the bundling bundling monetary policy and technical changes together, and trying to move us towards a solution on that. But apart from that, I think we've pretty much covered what I was going to do. So.
All right, cool. So that sounds like a good opportunity to wrap this thing up in a bow. So we have there's 4 or 5 very important things happening in the forums right now. We need to get some clarity around how those get pushed forward and when we consider them to be done or not. So if you have ideas or thoughts, please join us there, and let's iterate on this process, please. All right. Cyrus, I'm going to hand it off to you at this point.
Sure. Can we very quickly discuss the polls that concluded today? If I'm not mistaken, there was no change in any
that's
of the
a
monetary.
very interesting thing, because the GSM and urgency and the results of
like, can we talk about? Yeah, can we talk about how the GSM hasn't passed yet? But then also, I think we got lucky with the monetary policy again, if I'm not mistaken. The rates were all voted the same on fairly low vote.
So I'll just point out this one. I voted specifically to get them the same because we haven't passed the governance security module yet. So it's possible other people have done
That's interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Cyrus. Yeah, we should talk about it. So go. What are your thoughts on this situation?
Well, I was actually just wanted to make sure that operationally on the polling side, we don't need to put out a new executive tomorrow, correct?
I haven't looked into it because the polls end as soon as I start jibber jabbering in these calls. So I haven't looked. Yeah, this raises this sort of ties into the process we're talking about in the forums, right? Like, well, how does a debate happen? How does a signal get mentioned? Whose job is it to push these things forward and make them happen? And there's sort of that same kind of thing happening in the governance portal too. Right? So the GSM happened. The ecosystem rallied around the need to have this thing. They secured the legacy executive or the current executive, so the risk of that governance capture was lowered. The governance security module went in, the OSM, a bunch of work happened, and then that was the end of the story, I guess. And it just sort of petered out. So we need to figure out what happens after that, right? Like, how do we maintain, if there's urgency here, how do we maintain that sense of urgency? If there's things that people need to do, getting everybody fired up to secure executives and support new executives. Perhaps there's a step that happens that needs to continue. Like, campaigning is the thing that we've touched on before, but maybe campaigning is something that this ecosystem needs, or our protocol needs, where if the GSM is that important, then we presumably the community and the ecosystem should have been talking about it all the time during the last week or two, not just in the 3 days after that blog post went up. So, anyways, yeah, it'd be interesting to see whether this thing actually gets ratified.
All right. Okay, so I can do a quick state of migration. 1 sec. All right. So we are at 68.8 million DAI, which is, I think, about 9 or 10 million more than the previous week. So I think the migration is still kind of underway and progressing at a fairly strong pace. So last week we saw a little bit of buildup in the migration contract that maybe implied that things were slowing down a bit, but I think actually over the past few days, the migration contract has been fairly empty once again. So I think we're at this, I think we're still in a good spot. We haven't really hit that slowdown quite yet where we have to start thinking about any additional measures, which is, I guess the voters kind of agree because monetary policy stayed the same. And Psi similarly has fallen down to 45 million. I think this was about a 6 or 7 million drop. Couple interesting things, the collateralization ratios are getting quite low, 247% for Psi, and I think DAI is at around 260%. I actually don't think it's on the DAI stats page, but yeah, the markets took a bit of a dip last week. I think this is near the lowest it's been. My data, I'm showing that, yeah, well, Primoz told me that it was near the lowest it's been. Yep. One interesting thing is that the kind of a side thing is we're seeing the DeFi saver is maybe starting to get a little bit of traction. It's protected 50,000 ETH worth of CDPs, which I think is pretty cool, and about 100,000 BAT. So yeah, they have here 5.5 million worth of collateral. So that'll be interesting to continue to monitor over time. Let's see what else. ETH locked in the combined ETH locked between MCD and SCD is also at an all-time high. They're about 2.3 million ETH. For DSR utilization, I don't think it's changed much. I think it was around 25% last week, but we got a few exciting announcements in the past week or so about that would affect the DSR utilization. So first was, I think Compound is going to be implementing their unutilized DAI into the DSR. And I think that should be, let me see if I have the number here. So there's about 13 million DAI in Compound, which could hit the DSR. Additionally, I think they are close to allowing borrows against supply DAI, and once that's enabled, we might see more migration from Psi to DAI within Compound. So presumably the hypothesis is that Compound Psi suppliers have not migrated because the functionality is not quite the same. They can borrow against Psi, but not against DAI. So any short sellers that use Compound to facilitate that trade would not have migrated yet, and hopefully that should change soon. So I think there might be a good bit of migration activity, generally speaking, coming from Compound in the coming weeks. And then a second announcement was that OKX, which is a fairly large exchange, will be incorporating the DSR for its DAI deposits. That should be super
Cyrus?
interesting. Yep.
Can you reload the page?
Yeah.
So courtesy of T-Bone, I think you'll be able to see the collat ratio now. There it is.
Awesome. Cool. Right. So Yeah, I think they'll be the first major exchange to incorporate the DSR for their DAI deposits. I think between Compound and OKX, we could see 50% DSR utilization rate. And I think maybe the OKX integration can maybe hopefully spur some other exchanges to do the same. So basically, I just think it's too early to be drawing too much stock into this number quite yet, because the system is still getting up and running. Also, as a quick reminder, the DSR utilization going up based off of existing DAI would not affect the DAI price, just kind of all internal accounting measures. I think that's roughly it for what I have for the migration.
So
Any questions?
There's a couple of people asking about
the debt ceiling.
The debt ceiling, yeah.
Yep, forgot about that. Okay, so the DAI debt ceiling is nearing its limit. There's about 7 million left, but I think, or I guess 9 million for the ETH one. Yeah, certainly I think it's reasonable to bump that up if we do kind of a similar reduction in the Psi one, which I think is at 95 right now. So maybe doing like another, I think last time there was a 25 million increase and decrease there, right? And I think from the premise of continuing to facilitate the migration, I think it's certainly a possibility, or certainly reasonable. Beyond that, beyond the kind of the arguments that we used from the beginning in the migration risk construct, don't have too much to say on the debt ceilings right now. But certainly we can spin up like a polling process, or maybe do something with the forums on that.
So a couple of there were some sort of related process questions around this, which was whether we should create signal requests to change the debt ceilings, like we did for the SCD one back before MCD was released, or whether we should, or whether we can expect, I guess, you to create a forum post and create the necessary on-chain poll.
Yeah, this is quickly becoming one of the stickier issues from my seat, in the sense of helping facilitate the community do certain things, or just leading the charge myself. Happily, I'm not in a position to make that choice, and I don't think anybody other than the community is. So until there's kind of like, I guess I would be waiting on strong community signals, or I'm not really sure. But I mean, what I can say is I'm not just going to go out and say we should do this ASAP.
I mean, so I guess I think, so my sort of question towards this is coming from, like, last time you created a forum post, you put it on chain, and we just voted on it. My expectation, I guess, was that we would continue in that vein, but I guess if we want to do it differently, then we should start.
Yeah, I mean, again, the governance processes around it and the standardization around it, probably out of my domain of knowledge, right? I'm happy to do it however the community wants, and maybe Rich, as a governance facilitator, can also, I guess, along with you, can try to standardize some processes. I'm kind of, I think us on the risk team, we kind of feel it to be flexible.
Yeah, I mean, my personal point, my sort of personal point of view is that you guys should do whatever you need to do to the debt, right? I don't know how many people share that though, so maybe we need to discuss and figure out.
So it's my understanding that risk teams are meant to like recommend certain like parameter changes, right? And then maker token holders, or I guess I don't know if it goes straight into a vote for what, you know, risk team recommendations, or if it should go through a signal request on the poll. But it sounds like the blocker here is that there's nobody to own the signal request thread. And the main question I think is, should the risk team own those signal request threads? if it starts with a signal request thread and not directly with an
Yeah,
on-chain poll, like it
So-
did last time.
Yeah,
And last time that happened because it was a question of urgency. We didn't have a lot of time, and we were coming up very close on the debt ceilings. So I think right now is a good time to like better define this process.
Well, I think let's zoom back. I mean, what is the purpose of a risk team? And I think you kind of answered my opinion. You kind of answered the question by the way you framed it. By the very nature of a risk team presenting a recommendation, if you're putting it from a recommendation to go to a poll, I don't think it should definitely, in my opinion, it shouldn't go directly to an executive vote. It would just be one of the polls that people can vote on chain to agree or disagree with the recommendations on an individual or on aggregate from a risk team. By nature, that's I think what their role is to circumvent, not necessarily circumvent, mitigate the concept of having forums and focus it into folks that directly can frame an experienced position on, for example, the debt ceiling question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to see like an on-chain poll and then an executive. Like if you guys have a suggestion about what is a good number, I guess. Cyrus.
Yeah, I mean, I think keeping in line with the 25 mil is certainly a good amount.
I mean, you're referencing specifically the debt ceiling, and I'm more talking even more generic than that. I mean, at some point with whatever will be the next collateral type that gets put in, and I'm not even talking about the next collateral, the bigger picture of risk teams, plural, of what their role as a whole would be, in my opinion, to put forth those recommendations as experienced, seasoned folks that say the recommended, I'm just making it up, whatever the risk premium would be for collateral XYZ should be 3.5%, and then gather the community's consensus on an on-chain poll. And if it has sufficient weight or winnings or wins, then as being a binary yes or no, that it would then go to an executive and get aggregated with that week's aggregate executive vote.
Yeah, believe me, I know I'm very well aware of kind of the different philosophies behind how risk teams should operate. My personal view is that this is kind of a broader conversation that needs to be carried out over the coming weeks and months that had never really been an issue before, given that SCD management was fairly deterministic. And yeah, as we start to add new collateral types, concept of risk premiums, debt ceilings, there's a fair amount of not just complexity, but also subjectivity involved with a lot of decisions. And
completely. But I would even go further in the same way that there was an executive vote more than a year ago now, I believe. You guys correct me. Of the concept of using a scientific methodology for the maker system as a whole. I think this concept of that we're talking about, of having a risk team go directly to a poll and a poll to an executive vote. This general construct, while I may be an advocate for it, and maybe the community isn't, it's something I believe this concept in specifically this exact sequence is something that should find itself in its unique vote of an executive vote to ensure it's what everybody wants, to ensure we get that clarity.
Yeah, LongForWisdom writes, I think that's the general consensus. Defer the, quote, make proposal power to Cyrus.
Well, this comes back to something we touched on at the very beginning of the call, is this concept of empowered actors. But to empower a group of actors requires some kind of spark to make that happen. And that spark, I think, needs to come from the community. So if the community identifies a group of people that it wants to do specific things, there needs to be a very, very clear proposal and mandate set up around that so everybody can get a chance to signal. Because I guarantee that this is contentious and that there is going to be conflicting opinions. So it needs to be visible and very well thought out. I think that's my opinion.
Do you actually think it would be contentious? Like, my view is
Well,
this is going to be. Should we make the risk team make all the hard decisions about the debt ceiling? And it's going to be
this is
yes.
crypto. Well, it depends. Like if this is crypto, everything is contentious, right? Like so, it may be obvious, but there has to be a clear audit trail here that shows that, you know, this came from a group of people that had very well considered reasons for doing it, and that's what the world looks like now, because it has long-ranging implications. If as I said before, like the voting mechanism that we have right now is flat. We have, instead of having packages or domains or sandboxes or instant access modules or a bunch of other things, we just literally have 5 or 10 or 15, whatever number of levers we're going to have. And then we ask the world to start pulling these levers so they can hope they find a configuration that they like at the end of the week. If that model needs to shift, then there needs to be a very clear understanding of what that implies and who's doing it and what that means for the future and how we can reuse that model and all kinds of things. They need to be understood.
I mean, again, I wouldn't even go as far as to say it shifts as much as, instead of making it a replacement, I would make it an addition to, a complement of, such that if a risk team makes a recommendation, it doesn't forego the recommendation of the community. You know, if we have another forum thread and that gets enough consensus that is in conflict with a risk team, well, there's nothing wrong with having both polls at the same time and let the folks either vote yes or no.
Well, there's interesting models to be explored here too, and this has been brought up, I can't remember by who in the past, but you could have this empowered group of actors that where the community has decided is going to, in this domain, make these decisions, and their job is to make that decision every week and then let the ecosystem know what that decision is. The mechanism the community can use to vote on this is disagreements. So if this group of empowered actors is going to do something, they tell the ecosystem on Monday that this is what's going to happen at the end of the week. And that gives the community the opportunity to say no, instead of obligating them to constantly say yes, which I think is a very interesting model we can think about. Because that's, depending on who you ask, the big, if you want to distill crypto down to its very essence, it's the ability to exit or say no to something, right? And if we adopt that model, that might streamline things. I'm not entirely sure.
There's another practical consideration. I mean, essentially we're coming up on a conflict between the philosophical goals for maker.governance and what is possible in practice. Turns out that risk is an enormous amount of work, and kind of one of the initial goals was to have a community of decentralized independent risk teams who all kind of collaborate together, right? Until we can kind of bootstrap that like mini ecosystem, there's maybe some reluctance, or maybe could be some pushback from maybe even the community on potentially the powers of risk centralizing to just a few teams or even one team. It's kind of a weird situation, and it may even be a bit of a catch-22. But right, in trying to keep in mind the idea of decentralized governance, it's maybe potentially at odds with any one risk team coming out on a week-to-week basis saying, this is what we think everything should be. And sure, I mean, the community can always say no and all that, but I don't think it's not very clear in my mind how that would play out. I just think we need to kind of continue to move slowly and keep the discussions going in the community.
So, Cyrus, I have one small question before we get it finally, hopefully, into the state of the pegs. But I saw Robert Leshner came into our chats and talked about how MKR holders are going to control the interest rate model for MKR on Compound. Do you have any like loose thoughts or anything about that?
That's a secret. I can't talk. No, actually, I have absolutely no idea. I actually have. I saw that too. I have no idea what he.
I dug into it a bit and I looked at the blog post. I think that what he's saying is that ultimately they just apply a modifier to whatever it is happens in our ecosystem for determining the DSR. So there's no additional mechanisms being created somewhere. or additional governance layer being added to Compound. I think that it's 1.5, so like whatever the DSR is, the 1.5.
They just don't want to have to update the contract every time changes happen in Maker. That's it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Got it.
Yeah, at least that's what I remember when I was there, and it was July, and we changed the stability fee. Maker changed the stability fee 4 times, and people were displeased. Turns out every time you update a decentralized contract, people kind of lose it on crypto Twitter, which...
Yeah, well, those days are behind you. You can join up with Maker where everybody's pleased with everything that we do here. So you don't have to worry about that.
I've noticed in all these meetings I've been taking notes, the pleasure is palpable.
Yeah, it can do no wrong. Cyrus, is it State of the Peg time?
Sure.
Pegs. Any over-under on the battery levels today? I'm thinking 46. What are you animal? Plug that thing in.
Yeah, it is plugged in. That's with it being plugged in. All right. So, cool. Well, we'll just touch on what you want to hear first and then what you don't want to hear. All right. So, yeah, quite simply, DAI price, past week or so had been kind of hovering around $1, sometimes slightly above, sometimes slightly below. Most recent 24-hour period is slightly below, but like very, very slightly. Volumes have been up over the past week or so, so there's been a fair amount of trading activity. That's to be expected when ETH is doing funny things. But, you know, all in all, PEG seems to be holding. As far as MCD, like a fair amount of volume through Oasis, obviously, and then a little bit Uniswap. Coinbase has picked up a little bit. DYDX holding a surprisingly significant amount of volume, and then Kyber has been pretty active for MCD as well as SCD, so that's interesting. So just of the remaining amount of side trading that is out there, it's mostly been happening on Uniswap and then a little bit on Kyber, and a tiny fraction on Radar Relay. So yeah, and that as well was hovering slightly above and below PEG, most recently slightly below, a little bit more so than MCD, but also really tiny volumes, so take that with a grain of salt. Yeah, so all in all, things seem to be, and again, I'd hate to duplicate conversations about migration, but between migration, the amount locked up in DSR, what's going on with pegs and volumes, things seem to be proceeding the way people expect them to. As far as secondary lending, so the MCD borrow is not significantly changed on Compound. SCD borrow has come down. SCD supply has come down a little bit as well. And then MCD supply is still kind of holding there. And then obviously Cyrus touched on the whole thread about surplus going into DSR. So that's, again, something that would be interesting to watch. And then also, not to duplicate, but you know, up to 18 million in DSR so far. That's I think a 2 million rise in the last few days, but that's, you know, pretty solid. And yeah, as far as interest rates holding, so the BAT and ETH stability fee for MCD holding parity with the DSR seems to be working just fine for now. Not like the DSR is lagging pretty significantly, and it's not like DAI price is going out of whack every time there's significant trading volume. So that stability fee, though much, much lower than we had in the past seen for SCD, seems to be working all right for now. So that's like a whole nut to crack open at some point, is like, what is different about MCD? Why are these rates, you know, apparently a bit more stable in terms of impact on price? And does it have more to do with the fact that there's just been a large influx of DAI through migration that's kind of drying up liquidity and thus keeping prices stable even with lower interest rates? It's something to consider, because I think in the past, a lot of the thought process around this stability fee had been that when the stability fee is lower, it's easier for supply to jump up and thus by extension flood the market. Though supply has been going up, it's been going up primarily in the context of migration, and it's not been happening extremely rapidly. It's kind of like a slow and steady increase. So through those factors, seems that supply is increasing without necessarily flooding the market with a bunch of excess supply. And I think more the thing to watch there in terms of price has actually been this, I forget if it was on here or if it was somewhere else, but you know, the aggregate 68 million here for DAI plus the 45 or so from Psy. So, you know, that total 112, 113 million number is really sort of the actual supply right now. So I think watching that number is more of an indicator of what might or might not happen with price. And the sum of those two has been pretty steady. Obviously, it shot up a decent amount just as like migration initially picked up. But since then, it's been holding to a pretty steady total sum, even though the relative percentages have been changing. Another thing that I did this week, so just something to look at, was I started looking at collateralization. And it's really funny because I think, at least amongst analysts, people tend to look at the same things at the same times for completely different reasons. At least that's what I found. So also looking at collateralization here, I broke down the new vaults into collateral buckets. I was looking at the relative amount of collateral and debt in those buckets. So you can see here, like a majority of the debt for MCD, this is MCD specifically. Majority amount of debt for MCD has been sitting somewhere between 200 to 325% collateralization, which is actually fairly low. So part of this is a function of ETH price. Part of this maybe is a function of something else in terms of risk tolerances, risk preferences going into the new system. Maybe some lessons learned from SCD where people found, you know, that they were keeping a pretty significant excess collateral buffer. I don't really know. Again, nobody can ever really know like the reasons why people are doing things, but we can guess at what some of those reasons are. So yeah, I mean, obviously part of it is just math in terms of ETH price, but it will be interesting to watch if this sort of like taste for risk proliferates further going into MCD, or if this rebalances out to a higher curve, maybe centered more around 325, 350, 375 even, which would be more reminiscent of what SCD was like for a majority of its life cycle. As far as, yeah, question?
Vishesh, are we actually tracking that dynamically with the price to make sure to measure like on a time series basis what you just mentioned around how actually those collateral buckets actually might be moving from one to the other?
In the past we had, obviously everything has to be rebuilt with MCD, but not at the moment. I've just run sort of the static point in time on the current state of things. This is not a historical.
Yeah.
Yeah, that takes time to do.
Cool.
So as far as distribution, so this was something else interesting I noticed was I found that the top chunk of the MCD supply, so like the top 100, I think it was, vaults account for like 60 million, yeah, 58 million of the 68 million MCD. So pretty well concentrated into the top few vaults here. And even like the top 10 accounts for almost half of the MCD supply. So interesting to note there. And then of like the top 15 or so, the average collateralization ratio is still like in that sort of 250-ish range. So let me see. Approximately 250, 275. So that's a decent amount of risk to just be aware of. That one, just the fact that there's a decent amount of the supply concentrated into the top few vaults, but also that those top few vaults are not that significantly collateralized. You know, we've looked at these kinds of graphs in the past, and I've kind of viewed, you know, something between 150 and 250 to be like a comparatively higher risk, and then from 250 to like 350 to be a sort of medium level risk, and then 350 higher to be a lower risk. So that's kind of how I bucketed things here. But you know, everybody can sort of make their own determination of what they think is a tolerable level of risk. And I think this just kind of dovetails into the other point that I was making about the conversation that was being had earlier, in the sense that, oh, well, you know, risk analysts making recommendations on answers versus doing analysis. And I think there's an important layer there where, like, making these kinds of calls of what is or is not an acceptable level of risk is kind of a business and strategy question. But running numbers and quantifying sort of what is the state of things is a very, like, sort of analytics heavy problem that obviously not everyone can just solve on their own, because not everyone has the tools to do so. And so I think that's kind of like an important distinction, is what are the answers versus what do we do with the answers. And like, in my prior experience, like working in risk departments, like the general model was, you know, you bucket out a set of questions that you think are important from a business or strategy standpoint, you find answers to those, then you have a discussion about what they mean. And it's kind of a combination of a business role and responsibility and an analysis or risk role and responsibility. And having those two things in tandem is, you know, I think generally a good way to get to good answers and good strategy. But yeah, that's part of a broader conversation with the whole community about what they think risk is and what they want from risk. Okay, I am done.
Yeah, I was going, Vishesh, thanks actually for raising that issue. At last point, I was a little bit confused as well while the discussion was actually happening around the role of risk. And myself, same, been working with risk teams for a while now. And I do have the impression that usually kind of like the business folks come with some hypothesis and then hand it over to the statisticians to actually run the numbers and try to model and try to, you know, to provide an answer, but based on those hypotheses, and then kind of say, no, your hypothesis actually doesn't really work out, or it does. And yeah, I'm wondering whether actually that model would work in a decentralized governance way or not. Yeah, it's just an observation, basically.
Was that directed at me or just people in general?
Yeah, I guess most of it you and Cyrus, because you guys been involved with this for longer than anybody else. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll just touch on like my experiences earlier on, right, with Maker, which was, there was, Rich not being the last of them, a lot of sort of push, especially with like DIPEG, and when we were thinking a lot more simply about the stability fee, to just sort of give an answer and be like, okay, well, what should happen to the stability fee? Now, in my experience, I didn't really want to do that, because that to me is not necessarily the most rigorous way of wrestling with that problem and getting to a good answer, in the sense that if you have the same responsibility, or if the responsibilities of answering the question and determining the question and accepting or rejecting the answer live in the same place, that's not really a very well balanced system, in my opinion. So I don't think generally it's the responsibility of analysts to then go ahead and give the recommendation of this is what you should do, versus this is the answer to the question that we've agreed is important to ask. I think that's an important distinction. I think it helps keep things balanced. but many people have different philosophies on that.
I haven't heard it put that way before. That's pretty interesting. Thanks, Vishesh.
Yeah, there's a good recap, and it's also pleasingly loops us back to the beginning of the call where we're talking about whether empowered actors are the future and what that process looks like, and how do we acquire a strong signal from the ecosystem that that's the path that they want to go down. But it's complicated, so we need to figure that out. So as per usual, I'm going to encourage everybody to please join the discussion in the forums. We surfaced a lot of really interesting chats today. Lots of interesting things were discussed. Let's make sure that we don't lose that thread, and let's continue it in a longer surviving venue like the forums. All right, I think that. Sorry, was there
Very
one
quick
final
question? One last one. Where can I find the most information on potential collateral that we will insert into MCDI?
That is a great question. Right now, actually, that's probably a topic for an entire governance call, I think. This is something we're wrestling with. The plan right now, the system right now is that people from the ecosystem, partners, collateral providers fill out an application form. We have a bunch of documentation about that. And then they do a bunch of research, write a proposal, they drop it into our forums, and then in the forums, that process ideally would have led to rigorous debate and analyses and presentations and all the rest. But that actually hasn't happened. So there's a community working group that's starting to assemble to identify some of the challenges there. But the short answer is that there is no there's no list of partners waiting to get into the system other than what you can find on the forums.
Thank you.
But if you have ideas about how to optimize or improve, or you have just thoughts on collateral partners in general, reach out to us, because we're desperately looking for people from our community to help us out with this process so they can eventually own it completely. Because that's the narrative that we keep on reinforcing, and it's because it's true, and that's the goal of our foundation, is that we need to identify community actors to assume responsibilities, and we need to do everything we can to help them to assume that role. So if anybody here, or are you specifically Xenophon, I think that's you I'm talking to, I'm not sure, have ideas about collateral, please let us know, and we'll hook you up with the right people to talk about it.
No call next week.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, we're taking a holiday. I forgot what those things were like. At least some of us. I'm going to be on call, but don't cry for me. It's my pleasure to serve. But anyways, we're not going to have a call next week, so we'll regroup in the new year. And
are there still going to be governance polls happening?
Yes, I believe there are. I don't know if regional holiday, like presumably we're global, so we can't shut things down because we're waiting for Santa to show up in some parts of the world. So presumably the governance polls will go out for the monetary policy as per usual, but the rest of it will be shut down. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for all the great inputs. Talk to you in 2021, 2020. What year are we in right now?
Rich. We're in the roaring. We're going to be in the roaring 20s, guys. All right. Yeah. Everybody take care.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.